And it is a memoir about a midlife crisis. It, in my case, was maybe more sustained and flamboyant than some others, but no less or more painful.
Charles Gaines of Mountain Brook writes about building things. In his first 3 books, Stay Hungry, Pumping Iron, and Pumping Iron, The Women, he wrote about building bodies. In his latest book, he writes about rebuilding his marriage through the family project of building a home in Nova Scotia. Now, everyone works out, from Arnold Schwarzenegger to the receptionist who comes here on her lunch hour. But this world was nearly unknown when Gaines wrote his first book. I hope you don't mind if I start off by comparing you to Hemingway.
I can live with that.
Yeah. Something that I noticed about Stay Hungry when the novel first came out was I thought, here's a man who has done something like what Hemingway knew enough to do, and that was to find a new area, a new subject. Nobody knew anything about bullfighting much before Hemingway used it in The Sun Also Rises. The same thing was true with deep-sea fishing. And then along came Stay Hungry and bodybuilding, the world of bodybuilding. Did you think that the fact that people at that time didn't know much about that world helped the success of the novel?
Yeah, I think it probably helped and hurt. It helped insofar as it was new material, and people met it with a certain amount of freshness and energy, the reviewers did. It also hurt because back in those days, bodybuilding was associated with a lot of sort of seamy undersides of American society. You probably remember, a lot of people younger than we don't remember, but at one point bodybuilding was associated with all kinds of grimy things and was not thought of to be a productive pursuit, let alone an honorable one. So there was also that, and I think to a certain extent it hurt the book a little bit because it was thought of as a kind of night culture. I remember one of the reviews of bodybuilding being a night culture. But I think largely you're right that it did help because it was new material, it was fresh. Nobody had dealt with it before in fiction, and it's also very metaphorical, as is bullfighting. So that worked for the book, I think.
Right. The subject's been taken up since then, not again by you in fiction particularly, but I'm thinking of Harry Crews's book, Body.
Right.
And Crews seems to be saying that the world of bodybuilding, which gained a lot of respectability after Stay Hungry and Pumping Iron and over the next few years, has sunk again in its public reputation.
Yeah.
Do you think that's the case?
Well, I think that is the truth. As I remember, Body has to do with female bodybuilding. Yes. I did a book on that, and female bodybuilding is a pretty scary field because these women, a lot of the top women, are using male testosterone, male steroids to help them put on bulk, help them put on muscle mass, and it does really scary things to them. I mean, you know, it gives them a lot of male characteristics, hair on their chests and back, and other less palatable things that I won't bring up. But it's, you know, I mean, I think it's very easy to push bodybuilding too far, and I think it's been pushed that far, both with the men and the women. So I think it has started to take kind of a dive in the public eye. Of course, Arnold Schwarzenegger had so much to do with bringing bodybuilding, so to speak, out of the closet, and he was such a great spokesperson for it because he was charming, he was smart, he was attractive, he didn't use drugs to any great extent, and he made it seem a fun thing to do and an attractive thing to do. Right. And since Arnold, since he retired, the top male bodybuilders as well as the top female bodybuilders have not always been quite the good ambassador to the sport that Arnold was.
Right. Well, the characters in your first novel are very virtuous, and they're filled with vitamins and vegetables,
right.
and lots of clean living.
Yeah, well, back in that time, that was really the way people went at it. You know, that was in the 50s and early 60s, and there were steroids around, but I don't think many people were using them. There was certainly no growth hormone around, which is a hideous outgrowth of modern bodybuilding. People really were, at that point, they were coming to bodybuilding out of athletics a lot of times. and so they already had this sort of health-oriented way of looking at it, and it was a much healthier sport than it is now.
The a number of writers get involved. All writers try to sell their novels or stories to the movies,
Yeah.
and some actually get involved in doing the screenplay, which you did for Stay Hungry.
Right.
Right. How did you find writing a screenplay? Was it a congenial activity? Did you find it easy? Did you find it troublesome? What distinctions would you make between the process of making the screenplay and the original process of writing the novel?
Well, that's a very good question that really, to be answered properly, would require about an hour and a half. But just briefly, they're apples and oranges. A novel and a screenplay are completely different things. The biggest difference that you notice when you go into screenplay writing is that screenplay writing is collaborative. Novel writing is, you sit by yourself in a room and finish a book. In screenwriting, you might sit by yourself in a room for the first few weeks to get a first draft down, but then it's everybody's baby. Mm-hmm. And you've got the director fooling with it, the producers fooling with it, the actors and actresses adding their 2 cents worth, and everybody has got a spoon in the soup, and that can be frustrating. It can also be fun because you're working with other people, but it can be very frustrating if you take your work sort of seriously, as you tend to do when you go into screenwriting your first time. I mean, you still sort of think of the work as sacrosanct the way you do novels, and it's not. I mean, you can take these wonderful lines that you just think are immortal, and an actress will say the first time around, I can't say this. This is junk. I can't say it. And boom, it's gone. It's out of the script. And somebody's got to write something new. So you've got to get used to that, the collaborative nature of screenwriting. Another big difference, and I think it's one of the things that really surprises young novelists when they go into screenwriting, is that movies have to have certain elements in order to work that novels don't have to have, and vice versa. And if a novel doesn't have enough of, or in some cases no element, to make it cinematic, it's got to be put in. So a lot of times you'll find, a young novelist will find the intrusion of a car chase put into the script by somebody because the car chase has got to be there. Or a sex scene, for example, in a place where you'd be horrified to have it in a book, but a movie needs it. So it's a very different process and a very different form of, I think most people don't think of screenwriting as an art form. They think of it rather as a craft, and I think that's a good way to put it. It's not as difficult, for one thing, but it does have certain rules. You know, one of the best books on screenwriting actually lays out how to do it. I mean, you've got 3 acts in every good script. Every act has got a plot point. Every act has got a climax. And this book, the name of which I forget right now, is called something pretty banal like writing screenplays. But it actually shows you, takes a lot of old scripts, good scripts like Chinatown, for example, and shows you how those scripts fit the format. And presumably, all you really have to do to write a good script is to have good material and fit it to that format. So it's very different than novel writing.
Well, some screenwriters are asked to, or some novelists are asked to do a screenplay, and they mail it in. But you didn't mail it in.
That's Faulkner's famous story.
You stayed with the production company here in Birmingham through the whole shooting of Stay Hungry.
And
was it fun?
Well, it was fun. It was a mixed blessing, I'd say that. It was fun, and I think I probably got to inform the film a little bit more that way than I would have had I mailed it in. But it was also exhausting and in some ways depressing and in some ways destructive towards our family life. My wife and I had at that point, I guess we had all 3 children. We were down here living in a house outside of Birmingham, and it was very intrusive. Filmmaking is very intrusive. If you're here as a screenwriter, if you're on the set as a screenwriter, you're on call 24 hours a day. If some actress wakes up in the middle of the night and has a problem with a scene, the director calls you to come over and fix it. And 3 months of that can get pretty old. So it was fun, but it was also exhausting and in some ways demeaning, and I wouldn't do it again.
You haven't done it again?
I have not. I did the script for Pumping Iron. I did the script for Pumping Iron 2, The Women, but that was different. Those were documentary films, and there weren't quite the same pressures associated with it. I wouldn't do a script of one of my novels again on the set. I might write it and mail it in, but I wouldn't do it on the set again.
Right. A lot of writers, I suppose, unwillingly endure years of poverty and obscurity. But you didn't. You were lucky or not in that the first novel did well, and then there was the screenplay, the movie, and a good deal of exposure, notoriety. You've done a lot of thinking about this lately, I know. Which is a better path? Might your career as a novelist have taken a different path if the first novel had not been so successful? If you had written, say, 3 or 4 or 5 without a big financial and critical success?
I think that's a really fascinating question because the answer to it is so complex. I mean, I think in some ways it's a tremendous advantage to be successful early because it gives you credibility for your next books. It makes it easier to publish them. It usually makes it easier for you to get enough money to continue to write on because you get a larger advance. It puts you in some ways in a good position to get good agents, good publishers. So in a lot of ways it's a help. In some other ways, less obvious, more subtle ways, it can be a big disadvantage. It can set you up critically. My friend Jay McInerney, whose work I know you know, I was just with recently in Nashville, and he was we were talking about critics, which is a conversation that we have once in a while. And he was saying that he felt like Bright Lights, Big City, his first novel, which was a tremendous success, had doomed him with certain critics. So critics were looking for him now, looking for anything to snipe at. And I think that's a syndrome that happens a lot of times with a successful first book. Critics can be, like all of us, prey to jealousy, prey to all sorts of baser emotions. And a lot of times when a novel is a tremendous success, this is much more true with Jay than with me, but when it vaults the author into a sort of social position in America as well as a literary one, critics can get irritated by that, and they really look for you. The next book around, his second book was called Ransom, and it just got trashed by the critics, and it wasn't that bad a book. So they're both disadvantages and advantages.
But are there not pressures on the writer to produce that second book quickly, before the glow from the first book is extinguished? I mean, his agents after him, his publishers after him, his editors after him. And just for the sake of argument, might not that second book be better if he took as many or almost as long, as many years as he did with the first one?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there are pressures to turn out a second book quickly, not least of which your own pressures. And because, I mean, I think every first novelist, whether the book is a big success or not, has this sense of, God, how did I do that? Can I do it again? I mean, it's almost like magic to produce a novel, first of all. And secondly, if it is a success, you always feel a little bit bogus, particularly if you're young. You feel like, boy, did I ever get away with that, you know? And are these people serious when they say the thing is all that good? So there's a certain amount of pressure on you to come up to your own expectations for yourself a second time, and there's always this doubt that you can do it. And the second novel syndrome, of course, in this country particularly, has been a pretty sad one. Very few American novelists come up with a second novel that's as good as the first. A lot of times there's a lag, and then the third novel gets back towards the quality that they were expecting. In my own case, my second book was a nonfiction book, and it was a bestseller. And that made it even more difficult for me because it raised the expectations yet another notch. Stay Hungry did very well critically and so forth, but was not a bestseller. My second book was. So it took me 8 years to produce a second novel. And I've got to say that I put too many expectations on myself for that second novel, and the novel suffered from it.
Well, I didn't read Dangler when it came out, but I've read it since, and I got a lot of pleasure out of it. I really enjoyed it. I think the thesis is wonderful, that there is this camp or this place in the woods where a multi-millionaire fanatic is going to bring America's elite in touch with their bodies and nature and courage and so on.
Right.
How did that novel do? I don't remember.
It didn't do well. It didn't sell very well. It was bought a number of times for the movies, but never made. I still think it would make a terrific movie, but nobody's been able to figure out quite how to do it. But it did not do either critically or commercially as well as Stay Hungry did. And it was what you need to do as a writer after that happens, whether it's your second novel or your third novel, is forget it And all novelists that I know talk about the necessity to be involved in, by that I mean actually writing a book at the time when your past book comes out.
Sure.
So that you can take, you've got that inertia to carry you through whatever critical response it gets, whether it's very good or very bad. I did not do that, and it set me back. I mean, it was, I think, Dangler came out in '82, this is '93, and I have yet to write it. I've just started my third novel.
You are?
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about it for a moment. I mean, I know people are sometimes reluctant to say very much, but in general terms, where is it set, when, what's it about?
Well, part of it's set in Alabama, and it's a family novel. Of course, that's a big genre, but this is a family novel and horror novel, and two genres that I've been interested in for a long time and that I'm trying to combine in this book. And it's actually two stories wedded together. There's a horror story and a normal family story, and the two come together towards the end of the book. So it's going to be formally a challenging book, and I'm looking forward to. When I say I'm really at the conceptualizing stage yet, I haven't yet started it, but I've got a contract on it, and I've been doing a lot of thinking about it, and I've about got it figured out, so I'm nearly ready to roll on it.
Good, good. When should people look for it?
Well, I would like to think, Don, that I can write this novel fairly quickly. I'd like to think that I can finish it in a year, so that would mean, what, 18 months or so from now?
Oh,
I
wonderful.
hope. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
This building, this writers' conference, is just teeming with men who have had their midlife crises, or individually their midlife crisis.
This and every other building, right?
Except the difference here is that in this building, everyone's written a book about it.
Right, right.
So that some people fly fish through the midlife crisis, and some people build cabins through the midlife crisis. So you
got to do something there.
Right. But yours came out, pardon the expression, with a happy ending, and has resulted in a fine memoir, if that's. By the way, what word do you use to talk about
memoir's as
place?
good as any, I think. You know, it's a little sort of a biography of a section of my life, but I think memoir is the right word. And it is a memoir about a midlife crisis. It, in my case, was maybe more sustained and flamboyant than some others, but no less or more painful. And it was a fun book to write. I had a good time writing it, even though the book is about a lot of painful material. It was a fun book to write, largely because, as you mentioned, it had a happy ending. As you know, my wife and I were married early, had our children early, and lived a very sort of determinedly family-oriented life for years and years and years.
Absolutely.
And then in the 80s, 70s and 80s, I started to get a little bit of attention as a writer, a little bit of success, and started going to Hollywood to write scripts and so forth. And our children got older and went off to schools, and I found myself just being gone all the time and being away from home all the time. My wife and I started getting further and further apart. We both started losing sight of what we'd originally intended our marriage to be. And this went on for 8 or 10 years, and eventuated finally in my wife saying one day to me I was in a phone booth in Australia calling her and telling her that I was going to continue fishing another week in Australia. And she said, well, that's fine, I want a divorce. And so that really changed my life. And when I got back from this trip to Australia, she took herself down to New York for 4 months, and I did a whole lot of soul searching and trying to figure out where I had gotten off this path I'd laid for myself back in my 20s. And anyway, to make a long story short, we were able to put our marriage back together, and sort of by way of consecrating that and housing that new regeneration, we took our grown children the following summer, went up to Nova Scotia, bought a piece of land up there, remote piece of land out on the sea, and built a cabin with our own hands.
Right. Now that house, the family place, the house, is just to say it's a metaphor is not to say enough.
Yeah.
How troublesome was it to be going along, building a book about the building of a house, about the rebuilding of a marriage, a relationship, a family? That must have been an interesting piece of work for you to keep the metaphor moving and still not allow it to simply become some kind of allegory.
Yeah.
Is what I'm talking about something that
Sure.
you recollect from the making of the book?
Yeah, but when we were building the cabin, I had no intention of writing a book.
Ah.
I was keeping a notebook because I keep a notebook all the time, but I had no intention of writing a book. My agent and good friend Dan Green suggested that I do a magazine article about it, and I did that for a magazine called Men's Journal, and that article came out, and it elicited a tremendous amount of response, mail, phone calls, and so forth, and it really seems it sort of hit a nerve among men my age, largely, and some women as well in the country who had been through similar experiences and so forth. And so then my agent suggested that there was enough material, we just didn't make that into a book.
Right. And it is
Intimacy. Yeah, in fact, one of the great...
a Southern writer with these credentials that you have.
That's a good question. I don't know, because it's a very tempting genre and background to fall into. I don't tend to, and we still have, it's been terrific. We've really loved it.